Hi, this is Scott Dykstra presenting my interpersonal communication project for Liberty University's HSCO 508. After the title page, the second slide has the outline, providing the overview of what will be discussed for the PowerPoint that goes along with this video presentation. After the outline, you'll see the introduction page. Here are, in the following slide, have a few select quotes that help communicate exactly what interpersonal communication is. First, Stewart says that interpersonal communication is the type of communication that happens when the people involved talk and listen in ways that maximize the presence of the personal aspect. Then Vertino, below that, says that interpersonal communication is intimate human activity that can weigh heavily on our overall psychological health, wellness, and therefore warrants much discussion and attention. Vertino goes on in that scholarly article to communicate that her particular field, which is the medical field, often does not actually give much attention and teach much on interpersonal communication. And the next slide is another quote there. It says that the prefix inter in interpersonal communication means between the two people. So interpersonal communication literally occurs between people. In one sense, all communication happens among people, yet many interactions don't always involve us personally. And that's very important to note because sometimes interpersonal communication and communication in general doesn't have to be overly or inappropriately personal, but it needs to meet that communication need. Of course, in a personal relationship, it will be more personal. On the next slide, Stewart says there's a direct link between quality of life and quality of communication. With that in mind, and considering my personality blend that will be discussed later in the presentation, my overarching goal is to be a better listener by staying focused on what other people are saying through providing safety, truly understanding the speaker, and clarifying what's being heard. And those last things are from Peterson's Talker Listener card. The next slide contains the EMC equation. And that basically is identifying needs plus intentional resourcing results in enlarging a conversation. And that is very, very important. It's very important to realize what a person really needs versus what they're actually saying, what's behind it, and then using what you have to meet those needs, even if it's just conversationally. So somebody may say, oh, I'm fine, but they're really not fine. In a personal relationship, of course, we would want to use our resources to enlarge that conversation if that person wants to make sure that they're okay. On the next slide, Stewart says in this quote, if we experience mainly distant, objective, impersonal communicating, we're likely to grow up very one-sided. But if we experience our share of close, supportive, interpersonal communicating, we're likely to develop more of our human potential. That quote is particularly important as we consider our behavioral blend and the barriers to communicating personally. On the next slide, I broke down my mother and my father's background there, which of course makes up my background. I won't go into great detail there. Some of that repeats on the next slide, where I discuss more particularly my background. So on the next slide there, I'm a male, of course. I'm a first-generation higher education completer, as I'm 2 classes away from completing my graduate degree. I'm very excited about that. Nobody else in my family and generations before me has received a bachelor's degree, and my mother is the only one who has received her undergraduate degree. She received that later in her adult life. I'm the second child of 4 siblings. My parents divorced when I was a teenager. Very independent, outspoken, strong-willed, stable, determined, and I chose a white-collar profession. Positive influences is Christian faith, the determination, strong-willed, being a hard worker, and being outspoken. However, those three last ones can also be negative influences, and then also there's some addiction, depression, abuse, and poverty also that is in some of my family background. Those, of course, are negative influences. My behavioral blend on the next slide is D. There's two graphs, so the first one I got D and the other one I got DC. Carbonell says that understanding personality patterns is one of the keys to improving our relationships and solving the people puzzle and being able to understand people in general. There on the next slide, you'll see my first graph. That is being that D type is very task-oriented with results and dominance and being very direct and competitive of me. The phrase that's used to describe D is, "This is expected of me." And the next slide is my second graph, which was DC. So, of course, again, very task-oriented, but can be passive and active. Also, not always very people-oriented, and likes to have multiplicity of tasks, but actually only focusing on one at a time. And the phrase that goes with the DC type is, "This is me." On the next slide are the positive and negative influences, the decisiveness, leadership, assertiveness, and getting things done. However, those can also be negative when they're brought out to an extreme. I can and have been perceived as pushy or bossy. I'm not sensitive or compassionate enough. Sometimes I can be impatient or forceful along with that behavioral blend, and have a tendency to attack rather than step back and evaluate and be non-judgmental. Also, sometimes taking uncalculated risks. In the next slide, some potential barriers. As Burley Allen said, attention is really important to a complete conversation, really affects perception of what's being communicated, and sometimes I do have difficulty really paying attention to the other person. We tend to hear what we want to hear and are biased in our listening, and sometimes that definitely happens to me. And there's that flat brain syndrome with my personality type. Sometimes when I hear dissenting opinions or differing opinions, I really get that flat brain syndrome where I just get stuck and I can't move on. So overcoming those barriers, definitely working to enlarge conversations, stepping back to consider and calculate decisions, actively validating other people, respecting what they're saying, and listening to other people, and learning to be compassionate and kind. And then, as Stewart says in his levels of listening, listening better at a level 2. On the next slide, there's internal and external barriers for noise. My main ones, I would say, for internal is my ADD. I had it. I've worked very hard to overcome that. I still have it as an adult. I often tend to be impatient and think of what I'm saying next instead of listening, and sometimes question myself and can become judgmental. External noise pollution would be things that are going outside, whether it's temperature in the room, noises, work pressure, social media, interruptions. And the following slide are some solutions that I tend to use, which is practicing listening skills, praying and meditating regularly, focusing on that person and what they're saying, and providing myself with personal prompts to stay on topic. So speaking of staying on topic, in that next slide there, moving on to that, using the Peterson's talker-listener card from Why Don't We Listen Better, his book there, that prayer and meditation, and then practicing humility and patience. In conclusion, interpersonal communication is about the person behind the communication and that space in between, like breathing in and breathing out. It's directly related to the quality of life that one has, and it's directly related to somebody's background and their personality type. Overall, my goal was to become a better listener, and then we discussed steps that I'm taking to do so. My last page has the references that I utilized to gather information for this project. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.